Marlowe's head dropped onto a stranger's shoulder at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday. She didn't mean to. One second she was forcing her eyes open, watching the red-line tunnel lights blur past the window, and the next second her body simply gave up. 16 hours on her feet, 8 carrying trays at an all-night diner, 8 washing dishes at a bakery had finally caught up with her. Her legs had stopped feeling anything around the third stop. Her apron still carried the smell of fryer grease and burnt coffee. The shoulder she landed on was warm, solid. It didn't move away. She should have woken up, should have apologized, should have sat up straight like a decent adult, who knew better than to fall asleep on strangers at 2 in the morning. But exhaustion pulled her under like a wave, and somewhere in what was left of her consciousness, she thought. Just 5 minutes. The man whose shoulder she'd claimed didn't push her off. He stayed 6 more stops, missed his own. He tilted his shoulder slightly, just slightly, so her neck wouldn't ache. And when he finally stood, a slip of paper slid out of her apron pocket and landed on the seat. He picked it up. He read it. Sullivan Vasquez Rourke, the man all of Chicago had learned to look away from, first stood frozen on an empty platform at almost 2:30 in the morning. Not because of the number circled 3 times in ballpoint pen, because of the last name printed at the top. He didn't think he'd see her again. He was wrong. But not for the reason you're thinking. If you're already pulled in, drop a like. It helps this story find more people. Share it with someone who loves the ones that start at 2 in the morning, and hit subscribe, because what Marlowe has been hunting for 7 years is about to knock on her own front door. 4:30 in the morning. Sullivan Vasquez Rourke stepped out of the elevator on the 41st floor, and Deacon Fry was already there waiting for him, leaning against the wall with his arms folded across his chest, wearing the expression of a man who had been standing there for quite some time and fully intended to make sure the whole world knew it. You missed the 10 o'clock meeting with Prosser, I know. Prosser waited 40 minutes last night. Prosser doesn't wait 40 minutes for anyone, I know. Deacon pushed himself away from the wall and followed him down the dark hallway, and when they reached the office door, he spoke in the tone he only dared to use because he had known Sullivan since he was 20 years old. Because of a girl sleeping on a train, Sullivan didn't answer. That was the answer. Deacon let out a soft, drawn-out whistle, the kind made by a man who had just watched a building collapse slowly and silently. Then he walked away and closed the door behind him. Sullivan didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. Chicago gave off enough light on its own. The city spread out behind him like a live circuit board, and he crossed the room without hesitation, heading for the wall behind his desk, where one wooden panel looked exactly like every other panel around it. He pressed it. It opened. There wasn't money inside the safe. There was never money inside it. The money was kept somewhere else, watched over by other people, and Sullivan had never thought about it for more than a single passing moment at a time in his entire life. Inside was a sheet of paper. Lined paper, cheap, torn from a notebook. The handwriting slanted to the right, the capital letters too large, the lowercase letters too small. The handwriting of a man who had never finished high school and had never considered that a problem. The blue ink had faded to the color of ash. 11 names. He placed the sheet on the desk, flat and straight, the way a man might set down something too old to endure even one more careless touch. Then he placed something else on top of it. No one could see all of it. In the darkness, there was only the city light spilling over his shoulder and falling across one corner of the paper, and in that corner was a line of typed text, faint and crooked, printed in the cheap ink of a receipt printer that had been running far too long. A surname, Hartigan. He sat down. 4:35, 9 names had been repaid. It had taken Sullivan 7 years to do it. Quietly, no one knew. No one thanked him. He didn't want anyone to thank him, because gratitude meant they would have to know, and if they knew, they would have to ask why, and the answer to that question was something he couldn't say, not even inside his own mind. The second name on the list now owned an auto repair shop in Cicero, and the owner believed he had received an inheritance from an uncle he had never known. The sixth was a widow in Berwyn, who received a letter informing her that her mortgage had been paid in full by a trust she had never heard of. The eighth never learned why his daughter had been awarded a full scholarship by an organization with no website. 9 people, 9 different ways, not a single word. The 10th was dead, no children, no one left to repay. That was the name Sullivan thought about most often. because it was the only one he would carry into the grave without ever having done anything to make it right. And then there was the fourth name, a woman, Nuala Hartigan, died in 2019, left behind 2 children. He had had their address for 7 years. He had never knocked on the door. The door opened. Deacon came back carrying a cup of coffee and set it down on the edge of the desk without placing it directly into Sullivan's hand. He never handed anything directly to him. No one touched Sullivan Vasquez Rourke without permission, and that rule was so old no one could remember who had created it, not even Sullivan himself. Deacon looked at the sheet of paper on the desk. He didn't look for more than a second. He had seen it before, once 7 years earlier, 3 days after the funeral, and once had been enough for a lifetime. "Are you all right?" Sullivan didn't look up. "Close the door." Deacon closed the door. Sullivan sat in his father's safe until the sun rose over Lake Michigan and turned the entire room the color of copper. He thought he would never see her again. Chicago was a large city, 3 million people, 800 square miles of streets and trains, and 2 o'clock in the morning rides, carrying people too tired to remember one another's faces. Chicago wasn't that large. A little before 5 o'clock in the morning, Marlo Hartigan opened the door to the 2-room apartment in Bridgeport by lifting it half an inch before turning the key. Because the hinge had been out of alignment since the previous winter and the landlord had never fixed it, and she had learned how to make it open without a sound. Cormac was asleep at the kitchen table. His cheek rested against page 340 of a structural engineering textbook as thick as a brick. The desk lamp was still on. The pencil was still in his hand, his fingers curved around it, as though he had fought to hold on until the final second and lost. Marlo took off her coat. She laid it over his shoulders. "You're home late," he mumbled, his eyes still closed. "You're sleeping on the chapter about shear stress. The chapter about shear stress is sleeping on me." She laughed. 3 seconds. She had only a brief sliver of peace in the whole day, and they were here, at 5 o'clock in the morning, in a kitchen with a dripping faucet. "Go to bed, Cormac." "Yeah," he said, and didn't move. She turned off the desk lamp. Then she went into her room, locked the door. She did it gently, turning the latch with 2 fingers so it wouldn't make a sound, because the boy in the next room had the hearing of a bat and a curiosity even worse than that. Then she knelt down, reached beneath the bed, pulled it out, a tin box. The lid had a dent in the left corner, and the picture had almost completely peeled away, leaving only half a reindeer and 3 letters from the word Mary. It had once held Christmas cookies. Her mother had bought it at the corner store in 2011, and no one in the house had finished the cookies. They had gone hard and been thrown away, but the box had remained. There weren't cookies inside. Inside were hospital records, certified copies, each page marked with a red seal. Appeals that had been denied, stamped 3 times, on 3 different occasions, with 3 different signatures from 3 people who had never once looked her mother in the face. Screenshots printed on standard printer paper, with black borders because the printer had been running out of ink. 2 Freedom of Information Act rejection letters, both using the same language, sent 14 months apart. And in the center, kept separately inside a clear plastic sleeve, was a copy of the organ transplant waiting list from 2019. One name had been crossed out. Another name had been inserted above it. 7 years of paperwork, arranged by date, then by source, then by level of credibility, with colored tabs along the edges and a handwritten index on the first page. The arrangement of someone who had studied law for 2 years, then dropped out, and had never managed to lose the habit. On top was a piece of cardboard cut from the back cover of a notebook. Across it was a single line, underlined twice, the pen pressed down so hard that the words had left an imprint on the other side. Vasquez Freight and Holdings. Who signed the check? Marlo didn't take anything out. She didn't read it again. She knew every word inside by heart, the way people memorize a prayer they no longer believe in but still recite every night. She only looked at it. Then she closed the lid, pushed it beneath the bed. She kept pushing until the edge of the box touched the grout line between the 3rd tile and the 4th. Then she stopped, checked it with her eyes, and sat back. Outside, the city began making its first sound of the morning, a garbage truck somewhere 2 blocks away. Marlo climbed onto the bed without taking off her clothes, because if she took them off, she would only have to put them back on again in a few hours. And that calculation saved her 4 minutes, and she was the kind of person who still counted 4 minutes. She set her alarm for 4 hours later. Her shift at the bakery began at 9 o'clock. Before turning off her phone, she opened her notes, scrolled all the way to the bottom, and added one more line to a list already 262 lines long. Then she lay down, stared up at the ceiling, and during the 40 seconds before sleep took her, she thought about something completely absurd that she would never tell anyone, not even herself during daylight. She thought about a shoulder. She didn't know whose it was. She couldn't remember the face. She couldn't remember the coat, couldn't remember the voice, couldn't remember anything at all, because she had fallen asleep before she had the chance to look. She only remembered that it hadn't pulled away, and in 7 years, it was the first time anything in this world hadn't pulled away from her. Marlo Hartigan didn't just serve coffee at Sallow's. She had also taken a grueling night shift at the bakery to keep them afloat. She simply hadn't told anyone about the second job yet, not even her brother. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Marlo pushed open the door to Sallow's diner, and the smell of burnt coffee greeted her like an old dog, a smell that had soaked into the walls for 30 years and would still be there when all of them were dead. Table 6 still had one bent leg. It was still propped up with a piece of cardboard folded into quarters. She had folded it with her own hands 4 years earlier, and no one had replaced it. Mr. Tobin was sitting at table 3. Black coffee, 12 years in the same place, with the same cup, and the same way of resting his hand on the table as though he were keeping it from flying away. Marlo tied on her apron and stepped into the rhythm she could follow in her sleep, because, the truth was, she often did. She picked up the coffee pot. She passed table 3. She filled Mr. Tobin's cup before he had the chance to look down at it. "Thank you, Mr. Tobin." That was the entire conversation. It was the same every day, and they both preferred it that way. At table 9, a truck driver ordered 1 serving of fried eggs and sat looking out the window. Marlo brought him 2. "I ordered 1. The register's acting up. The second one's free." The register wasn't acting up. His dog had died the month before, 13 years old, named Duke. And for 13 years he had always ordered 2 servings of eggs because 1 was for Duke. And Marlo had nothing to say about that, so she simply brought out 2 servings and went somewhere else. Saturdays belonged to Rosie. 6 years old, always came in with her mother, always sat at table 11, always asked the same question. "Do you have anything today?" "Let me see." Marlo bent down beneath the counter and pretended to search for a very long time, then brought out an oatmeal cookie wrapped in wax paper. No peanuts, never peanuts. She kept them separate in a box with a handwritten label, and she was the only person allowed to touch that box. Rosie smiled. Her mother smiled. 3 seconds of pure warmth, with nothing behind it, no one wanting anything from anyone else. Bridget Okonkwo-Hale stood behind the counter, wiping the stone surface with the same cloth she had been using for 6 years. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Someone from the owner is coming tonight to sign the paperwork." Marlo was stacking glasses. "What owner?" "You're the owner." Bridget's hand stopped. Half a second. Then she began wiping again, in the same circle, at the same speed, as though that half second had never happened. "I only manage the place, sweetheart." Marlo set the glass down. She turned to look at her, and Bridget still didn't look up. 7 years Marlo had worked in this room. 6 years Bridget had paid her, advanced her wages when Cormac needed medicine, let her sleep in the storage room for 2 nights during the month when the electricity had been cut off. 6 years. And Marlo had never asked that question. When she thought about it later, that was the strangest part. Because she was the one who asked questions. She was the one with a tin box beneath her bed because she refused to stop asking. She had written 38 petitions to people she didn't know, called hotlines no one ever answered, stood in line for 4 hours inside a government building to ask one question and received a sheet of paper telling her the question wasn't valid. But here, in this room that smelled of burnt coffee, she had never asked who paid her wages. Maybe because this was the only place where she didn't want to discover anything. "Who do you manage it for?" she asked. Bridget wrung out the cloth. Water ran into the sink. She hung it on the hook, straightened it carefully, and only then did she turn around. And when she turned, she smiled. Her smile always came about 1 second before her answer, and Marlo had grown so used to it that she had never noticed it was the way people bought themselves time. "For the person who pays you," that was the answer. But it didn't answer anything, At 9 o'clock that night, the bell above the door rang, and the diner fell silent in a way Marlowe had never heard in 6 years. The first person to enter was a woman. Rimless glasses, black leather briefcase, hair tied low, not a single strand out of place. Her heels struck the tile in steady beats like a clock, and she walked straight to table 8 without looking at anyone, as though table 8 had been placed there at the birth of the city for the sole purpose of waiting for her. Behind her came a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat, his eyes sweeping across the room in 2 seconds and pausing for half a beat at the back door, the kitchen entrance, and the window overlooking the alley. Behind him came the man. Marlowe didn't see his face first. She saw his shoulder first. Mr. Tobin stood up. He placed his money beneath the cup, as he always did, but this time he did it quickly, and he picked up his hat, and he left without looking at anyone, without looking at her, without saying the goodbye he hadn't missed once in 12 years. Why is he leaving, Marlowe thought. He never leaves before 6 o'clock in the morning. Bridget was in the kitchen, and Bridget didn't come out. Marlowe picked up the coffee pot. She walked to table 8. Coffee? Black. His voice was low and even, never rising, never falling, the voice of a man who had never needed to speak loudly. Her hand trembled, not because she was afraid, because she had seen that shoulder from 4 inches away for 6 train stops, and her body recognized it before her mind understood what was happening, the way people recognize a scent from childhood without being able to name it. The woman spread the documents across the table. A thick stack held together by a metal clip, each page marked at the edge with a yellow note placed exactly where a signature was needed. 9 properties, she said. 6 on the south side. 3 on the west side. You only need to sign them over to the new legal entity. He signed. He didn't read. He had already read them. Marlowe poured. The coffee nearly overflowed. She looked down at her hand and thought, with perfect calm, that she had been serving coffee for 6 years and had never once come close to letting it spill, and that perhaps she should say something, and that the proper thing to do was apologize and walk away. She said, "Have we met before?" The woman looked up. The broad-shouldered man looked up. The entire room suddenly seemed to have weight. Sullivan raised his eyes. Gray, unblinking. He looked at her longer than an ordinary question required, long enough for Marlowe to hear the coffee machine groaning at the far end of the counter, long enough for her to think that she would remember these 3 seconds forever without understanding why. "I don't think so." A pause. "If we had, I'd remember." The woman gave a soft laugh, a brief, polite laugh, the kind made by someone who considered everything that had just happened a minor disruption in the schedule. She tapped the tip of her pen against the document. "Page 3, sir." He signed page 3. Marlowe stepped back once, then twice. She stood behind the counter with the coffee pot still in her hand, and she didn't set it down because she didn't trust her hand to place it there without dropping it. They signed for 7 more minutes. No one said anything else. Then the woman gathered the papers, tapped the edge of the stack against the table twice to straighten it, placed it inside her briefcase, and snapped the locks shut. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and stopped at the counter on her way out. She smiled at Marlowe in the most courteous voice in the world. "Have you worked here long?" 6 years. That's a long time. She didn't say anything else. She simply looked at Marlowe for another 1.5 seconds, and that 1.5 seconds was something Marlowe would think about many times over the next 7 weeks. Sullivan stood. He walked past the counter. He didn't look at her. At the door, he stopped. 1/2 second, then he left. The bell rang. The door closed. The diner became a diner again, smelling of burnt coffee, with table 6 resting on its bent leg, 8 empty chairs, and the cup Mr. Tobin had left behind still warm. Marlowe stood there with the coffee pot in her hand, and a truth fell onto her like a brick dropped from the 4th floor. She had spent 7 years working in a building owned by the name she had been hunting, and her employer had known it for all 7 years. The car pulled away from the curb outside Sallow's diner at 9:21. Nadia Voss sat in the front passenger seat, her leather briefcase resting neatly on her lap. Deacon Fry was driving. Sullivan sat in the back, looking out the window. 3 blocks later, Deacon spoke in an unconcerned voice, his eyes still on the road. "The train girl. Don't call her that. Then what should I call her? The woman you let sleep on your shoulder for 6 stops. The woman who made you miss the meeting with Prosser. I need something to call her, Mr. Vasquez-Roark. I work in security. I have to call everything by some kind of name." Sullivan said nothing more about names. She asked whether we'd met before. And you said no. I said I'd remember. Technically, that wasn't a lie, very lawyerly. Without turning around, Nadia spoke in a voice as flat as the surface of a table. I can hear you. You hear everything, Deacon said. That's why they pay you so well. That's why they pay me so well and don't invite me to dinner. Deacon laughed. Sullivan didn't. The car crossed the bridge, past the place where the railroad tracks cut across the road, and for half a mile, no one spoke. The city lights moved across Sullivan's face one band at a time. Bright, then dark, then bright again. Like something counting down when no one yet knew what it was counting toward. Then Deacon spoke, and his voice was entirely different. It was no longer the voice of a man sitting behind the wheel and teasing his employer. It was the voice of the man who had stood beside Sullivan in a church parking lot 7 years earlier and hadn't said a word throughout that entire day. Why didn't you tell her the truth? Sullivan looked through the window. Because if I said I remembered her, she would have asked why I remembered. So what? Then I would have had to answer. Deacon looked into the rearview mirror. He saw his employer's face there, half in light and half in shadow, and the half caught in the light told him nothing at all. Deacon didn't ask anything else. That was what Deacon Fry did best, better than shooting, better than remembering faces. He knew exactly when the next question was the one he wasn't allowed to ask, and he stopped precisely there, every time. The car turned onto the avenue. The clock on the dashboard changed to 9:37. In the front seat, Nadia Voss opened her leather briefcase. She took out a hardbound notebook with a dark blue cloth cover, the kind no lawyer in the city used anymore because everything had been stored on computers for 15 years. She turned to the final page. She drew out her pen. She wrote one line. She wrote slowly, without haste, her handwriting small and orderly, almost like print, and when she was finished, she read it once, gave the faintest nod to herself, then closed the notebook, returned it to the briefcase, and snapped the locks shut with 2 fingers. She hadn't written in English. Sullivan didn't see it. He was looking through the window, watching a red line train run beside the car for nearly 10 seconds before rising onto the elevated tracks and disappearing. And during those 10 seconds, he didn't think about Prosser, didn't think about the 9 properties he had just signed over, didn't think about anything he was supposed to be thinking about. Deacon didn't see it. He was watching the road, but that single line would destroy 3 lives over the next 7 weeks. 3 days later, they called every employee in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the diner's dead hour, the hour when there was nothing but sunlight and dust and not a single customer. 8 people sat on 8 chairs pulled from 8 different tables. Bridget stood against the counter with her arms folded. Sullivan stood at the far end of the room, his hands in his pockets, neither sitting nor speaking. Nadia Voss gave the presentation. She had charts. She had a projector small enough to fit in one hand, casting its light onto a wall that smelled of burnt coffee, and across that wall appeared numbers no one in the room had ever seen about the very place where they worked. Cut the night shift. Close from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock in the morning. Reduce operating costs by 22%. Revenue during those hours accounts for 4%. No one looked up. 8 employees, 8 bowed heads. Some stared at their hands, some at the floor, some at the crack across the tabletop that had been there since before they were born. Marlowe raised her hand. Then she didn't wait to be called on. Mr. Tobin has sat at table 3 for 12 years. Nadia stopped in the middle of a sentence. He doesn't eat. He orders 1 coffee, he pays for the coffee, and he sits there until morning. His wife died in 2011. His house is too quiet. That's a bad business model, Nadia said. That's why people come back. People come back because of price and speed. There are 4 fast food chains within a 1-mile radius, and all 4 are cheaper than we are. No, Marlowe stood. She didn't look at Nadia when she spoke next. She looked straight toward the far end of the room, at the man with his hands in his coat pockets, the man who had signed 9 pages without reading them. People come back because someone fills their coffee cup without having to ask. The entire room held its breath. No one argued in a room with Sullivan Vasquez Rourke. Bridget closed her eyes for half a second, the way people close their eyes when they hear brakes screaming in the street. He looked at Marlowe for a long time. Show me, Nadia turned her head. Sir, we still have 11 properties. Show me, he led him through the diner. Table 9, truck driver. He orders 2 servings of eggs. He only eats 1. His dog died last month, 13 years old, named Duke, and he still orders 2 because his hand has been ordering 2 for 13 years. I bring out both and charge him for 1. Nadia tapped her pen against her notebook. Once. Table 12. Night shift nurse from Mercy Hospital. She comes in at 4 o'clock in the morning, sits here, and doesn't say anything. She has just spent 12 hours in a place where someone calls her name every 2 minutes. She doesn't need food. She needs somewhere no one says her name. If we close from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock, she won't have anywhere to go. She'll sit in her car, table 6. The leg is bent. It's propped up with cardboard. I folded that cardboard 4 years ago. Why don't you replace the table? We did. 3 times. No one would sit anywhere else. He looked at the table. Why? I don't know, Marlo said. That's their story. My job is to leave it there. He listened. He truly listened, and that was what unsettled Marlo most, because she had prepared herself to argue with a wall, and the wall was listening. Nadia tapped her pen against the notebook a second time. Keep it open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Sullivan said. Remove the closure plan. Give me a revenue report in 3 weeks, sir. I don't say things twice. Nadia turned off the projector. She did it very slowly, very neatly, and her face didn't change by even 1%. At the door, Marlo called after him. Mr. Vasquez Rourke. He stopped. He didn't turn all the way around. Are you sure you've never met me? I'm certain. The door closed. The bell rang. A car engine started outside. Marlo stood there for a moment, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, her heart beating somewhere in her throat. Then she went into the diner's office. Bridget was outside stacking chairs. No one was watching her. Marlo pulled open the desk drawer. The transfer documents were still there. The diner's copy, metal clip, 9 properties, 6 on the south side, 3 on the west side, and in the corner of every page that name printed in bold, perfectly straight, with nothing to hide. Vasquez Freight and Holdings. Marlo took out her phone. She photographed every page. She laid each sheet flat, lined up all 4 corners, and retook any photograph with glare. 2 years of law school, 6 years and 38 petitions, 1 tin box beneath her bed, and her hands didn't tremble at all. 32 photographs. Through the office window, Deacon Fry saw everything. He was standing outside, 4 meters away, having come back for the phone he had left on table 8, and he stood perfectly still, and he watched. And for the first time in 7 years, Deacon Fry had to decide whether he should tell his employer. At 11 o'clock that night, there were 3 customers left in the diner, and Marlo went to the back storage room for cleaning cloths, because the stack behind the counter had been empty since 8 o'clock. The storage room door had a broken latch and a gap as wide as a finger where the hinge no longer lined up, and Marlo had never paid attention to that gap until tonight. She heard voices first. Not loud. No one was loud. That was the first strange thing, because in the alley behind Salo's diner at 11 o'clock at night, people usually didn't speak softly. She pushed the door open. Only a little, just enough to see. 3 men stood in the alley beneath the only light still burning. Sullivan was in the middle. She couldn't hear clearly what they were saying. The wind was blowing the other way, and the kitchen exhaust fan was running, and the language might not have been English. But she saw the way they stood. It wasn't respect. Marlo had seen respect before, and respect had a different shape. Respect was people leaning slightly forward. This was something else. Something more careful. The other 2 men stood at the slightest angle, both of them at exactly the same angle, as though their bodies had made the decision on their own without asking permission. Like water flowing around a rock. Not because the water was afraid of the rock, because the rock was there and the water had no other choice. Sullivan said 1 sentence, very quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. His hands remained in his coat pockets. The man standing in the middle dropped to his knees. No one touched him. Marlo stood frozen with the stack of cloths in her hands, and what sent a chill down her spine wasn't that he had knelt, but that the other 2 men weren't surprised. They didn't step back. They didn't look at each other. They simply stood there, and one of them reached out as though he meant to help, then pulled his hand back, as if he had suddenly remembered that he wasn't allowed to. The kneeling man said something, quickly, urgently. He repeated it 3 times, the same sentence, the same phrase, his voice breaking in the middle. Sullivan listened. He listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He stood still until the other man had finished, and the silence afterward lasted long enough for Marlo to hear water dripping from some drainpipe above them. Then he nodded. Once. That was all. The other 2 men helped the 3rd man to his feet, and all three walked toward the mouth of the alley, and within 30 seconds they were gone as though no one had ever been there. Sullivan turned around. He saw her standing in the doorway with a stack of cloths in her hands. He didn't startle. That was the worst part. He didn't startle. He looked at her the way someone might look at a chair placed in the wrong spot. Go home. It's late. That man just knelt. Yes. Why? He looked at her, and when he answered, his voice was as even as someone reading the weather forecast on the radio at 6 o'clock in the morning. Because he knew what would happen if he didn't. Marlowe stepped back. Only one step. She didn't think. Her foot did it on its own, the same way the other two men had angled their bodies without thinking. But he saw it, and in that half-second, something on Sullivan Vasquez Rourke's face broke, so quickly that a blink would have missed it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shame. It was the expression of a man who had looked down and found blood on his hands without remembering where it had come from. Then it vanished, and his face became his own again. Marlowe? Yes. Don't go into the back alley again. He left. She got home a little before 2 o'clock. Cormac was asleep. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, and she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid of him. Because in that half-second, she had seen that he was afraid of himself. The next morning, there was a new table where table 6 had always stood. Oak, straight legs. All four exactly even to the millimeter. The kind of table that cost 3 weeks of Marlowe's wages and didn't need a piece of cardboard beneath it. Marlowe looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she set down the coffee pot, went out through the back door, opened the dumpster, and pulled the old table out. It was heavier than she remembered. The tabletop was stained with coffee and something yellow. She scrubbed it twice with hot water and vinegar, then turned it upside down and found the screw in the third leg, the one whose threads had been stripped for longer than anyone could remember, and she pushed a wooden toothpick into the screw hole and tightened it again. And the table was still uneven, but it leaned at exactly the angle the cardboard folded into quarters had been made to correct. She carried it inside, put it back in its old place. The oak table was pushed into the corner beside the jukebox that hadn't worked since 2007. Sullivan arrived at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He looked at table 6, looked at the oak table in the corner, looked at her. He didn't say anything. The old table stayed. On Thursday, it rained. Not a light rain, but the kind of Chicago rain that came in November, cold and sideways, driven by wind off the lake until it seemed to fall upward. Marlowe's shift ended at 9 o'clock, and she had forgotten her umbrella. She always forgot her umbrella. She had walked through rain for so many years that her body no longer considered it a problem. There was a black umbrella waiting by the diner door. It stood upright against the frame. A folded note was attached to the handle, written by hand in hard strokes with an ink pen, every letter standing apart as though the person who wrote it didn't trust them enough to let them touch. You'll need this. On Saturday. The light above table 12 burned out. Marlowe pulled over a chair and climbed onto it. He appeared below her, his hands in his pockets. You should have someone hold the chair. I've been climbing onto chairs since I was 12. Humor me. She didn't humor him. She changed the bulb, climbed down, put the chair away, and said nothing else. But from that day on, every time she pulled out a chair, some employee happened to be walking past, happened to have both hands free, happened to stop and hold the legs steady. Every time. No one said anything. No one was asked. On Monday, the health department arrived for an unannounced inspection. 98 out of 100, the highest score Sallow's Diner had received in 30 years. Before leaving, the inspector closed his clipboard and said to Bridget in the voice people used when they didn't understand what was happening but didn't want to ask, "Your file was marked for priority handling." Bridget thanked him. Marlowe stood behind the counter and knew immediately who had done it. She waited until the diner was quiet. Then she went to the corner table. "I didn't ask you to do that, I know." "Then why?" He didn't answer the question. He only looked at his coffee cup. "Listen to me." Her voice was low, but there was something beneath it. "Every time I've ever accepted something, I've had to repay it with something more expensive. Every time. Not one exception in 26 years. Not this time. Everyone says that." She walked away. He didn't call her back. That night, she came home at 1:40. The door was still locked. She lifted it half an inch and turned the key, and it opened as quietly as always. Cormac was asleep over his book. The faucet was still dripping. She went into her room, locked the door, knelt down, reached beneath the bed, pulled out the tin box. Then she sat perfectly still. The edge of the box wasn't resting on the grout line between the third tile and the fourth. It was 2 inches to the left. Marlo measured by the floor tiles. She always measured by the floor tiles, for 6 years, every night, without missing a single one, because it was the only thing in her life she could control down to the inch. She stared at the floor for a long time. Someone had been inside her home. The lock on her bedroom door hadn't been broken, but the brass frame had a tiny, fresh scratch near the latch, the mark of a landlord's master key, or someone who didn't need to break a latch to get inside day one. Her card was declined at the grocery store on the corner of Halsted Street. She swiped it again. Declined. She swiped it a third time, and the woman behind the counter looked at her with the expression Marlo had learned to endure when she was 19, and she left the basket there, $11 worth of groceries, and walked out. She went to the bank at 10 o'clock the next morning. The teller entered her account number into the computer, and the young woman looked at the screen, and the color drained from her face. Please wait a moment. She didn't make a phone call. She stood up and went into the back. The manager came out, a middle-aged man in a pale blue shirt. He looked at the screen. He looked at it longer than anything on a screen should ever require. Then he looked at her. Miss Hartigan. I advise you to leave. Why, I'm not permitted to say. My money is in there, $840. I need it by Friday, Miss Hartigan. He lowered his voice, and he didn't lean toward her. He leaned away. Please, day 3. Cormac called at 11 o'clock in the morning. Marlo was washing dishes at the bakery, her hands covered in suds, the phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear. Lo, my scholarship has been suspended. What? It says it's under review. It doesn't say what's being reviewed. His voice was confused, not panicked. That was the thing Marlo was most grateful for about her brother, even in that moment. I haven't done anything wrong. I checked. My grades are fine, 3.7. I have enough volunteer hours, 4 more than required. My tuition was paid on time. Have you called the academic office? I called this morning. Waited 40 minutes. I also wrote an appeal email and sent it to the department chair. They said my file had been flagged. A pause. But they wouldn't say who flagged it. They said the system doesn't show that. Cormac, I can handle it. I just wanted to tell you. Don't do anything, all right? You're already working 16 hours a day. Day 5. The notice was taped to the door. 30 days. Marlo went down to the first floor and knocked on the landlord's door. He didn't open it. She heard the television go silent inside. Then footsteps. Then nothing, Mr. Petrakis. I haven't been late with the rent once. 4 years silence, Mr. Petrakis. His voice came through the crack beneath the door, quiet, and what chilled her was that he sounded tired, not angry. Don't make this hard for me, girl. I have a family. Then the footsteps moved away. Day 7. Marlo arrived at the diner at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Table 6 was empty. She tied on her apron, picked up the coffee pot, and walked past table 3 in the rhythm her body had followed for 6 years, and she stopped halfway because there was nothing to pour. Mr. Tobin hadn't come. For the first time in 12 years, she called his number. It rang 8 times. No one answered. She called again at 5 o'clock, at 6 o'clock, at 7 o'clock. She waited until 8. Then she took off her apron and walked 2 blocks to his apartment, a 3-story red brick building with a front door that was never locked. His door was locked, but it felt cold, abandoned. She knocked, but only silence answered. When she used the spare key she kept for emergencies, she found the apartment neat but empty. His worn leather suitcase was gone from the closet, and the framed photograph on the windowsill had been packed away. He hadn't been taken by force, he had been moved. Quietly, wisely. Mr. Tobin wasn't dead. Marlo knew that, knew it with certainty, without needing anyone to tell her. There wasn't yellow police tape outside the door. There wasn't a police car. There weren't neighbors standing in the hallway whispering. There was nothing at all. He had simply gone, and somehow, that was far more frightening. She didn't wait until nightfall. She didn't wait for the diner to empty. She walked straight to the corner table at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in broad daylight, in the middle of the diner, with 6 customers seated nearby, and Bridget standing behind the counter, and every one of them heard her. Was it you? Sullivan was reading something on his iPad. He didn't look up immediately. No, are you sure? He set down his coffee cup, very slowly. Then he looked up, and this time he truly looked at her. Marlo, if I wanted you gone, you'd already be gone. A pause. You wouldn't even know you'd left. That sentence should have made her pick up her purse, walk out the door, get on a train, and never come back. Anyone with a functioning mind would have done exactly that. But it was so honest that she believed him. That was the strangest thing about Sullivan Vasquez Rourke. The most frightening things he said were the only things she never doubted. Then who was it? I'm looking into it, Mr. Tobin, I'm looking into it. 3 days later, he gave her a name. He arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning as he always did, but he didn't open his iPad. He waited until she had finished pouring his coffee. Then he said, Marcus Odell. Marlowe stopped, a mid-level manager in logistics. He saw you photographing the transfer documents. He thought you were gathering information for a competitor. He acted on his own. He could do all of that, my bank account, my brother's scholarship, my landlord. He had access, and his brother-in-law works in the credit department. Marlowe looked at him for a long time. Where is he now? He doesn't work for me anymore. What does that mean? It means he doesn't work for me anymore. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He never said anything twice. That was the rule, and she was beginning to understand that the rule wasn't arrogance. It was a locked door. Marlowe believed him. She believed him, and later, when she looked back, she would see clearly that she had believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was that he was lying to her, and she wasn't ready for that possibility. 3 days passed. Her card was restored on a Tuesday morning, without an apology, without an explanation. It simply began working again, as though nothing had ever happened. The eviction notice was withdrawn. Mr. Petrakis knocked on her door, handed her a sheet of paper without looking her in the eyes, and said exactly 4 words. There was a mistake. Then he went down the stairs faster than necessary. Marlowe stood in the doorway with the paper in her hand and felt something very much like relief. And she hated it, and she felt it anyway. On the 4th day, Cormac called. Lo, what is it? My scholarship is still suspended. Marlowe was standing on the train platform. She stepped out of the flow of people. He said it had been handled. Yeah, I thought so too. I called the academic office this morning to confirm. A pause. But it's still suspended, Lo. The same message is still there. No one knows who flagged it. Marlowe said nothing. Are you still there? I'm here. Don't worry. I can handle it. I'm writing a second appeal. He ended the call. Marlowe sat down on a bench at the station and remained there for a long time with the phone in her hand. And trains arrived, and trains departed, and she didn't board one. Because there were only 2 possibilities. Either Sullivan Vasquez Rourke had lied to her, or there was someone inside his house whom he couldn't control. And she didn't know which possibility was more frightening. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Miss Hartigan? This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Your brother is stable. He called emergency services himself. Marlowe heard the entire sentence before she understood it. There was a delay of about 1.5 seconds between hearing and understanding, and during that 1.5 seconds, she was standing in the bakery kitchen with both hands submerged in the sink. Is he all right? He's stable. You may come at any time. She took off her apron and didn't say a word to anyone. 14 blocks. She had $11 in her wallet, and a card that had only started working again 3 days earlier, a card she didn't trust, and a taxi ride from there to the hospital cost $18, and she stood at the curb for exactly 4 seconds while she made that calculation. Then she ran. She ran 14 blocks through the November wind, crossed against 2 red lights, and her lungs burned, and she didn't stop. She pushed open the hospital room door. Cormac was sitting on the bed. His headphones were plugged in. He was arguing with a game on his phone, his fingers moving rapidly, speaking to the device in the voice he reserved only for inanimate objects. He looked up, pulled out one earbud. Did you run? Marlowe didn't answer. She couldn't. You're breathing like a dog. Shut up. She stood in the doorway with both hands braced against her knees for about 20 seconds, and the world narrowed into a white corridor and the pounding of her heart in her ears. I'm fine, Lo. I just ran out of medication 3 days ago. She sat down on the edge of the bed. 3 days, 3 days. Why didn't you tell me? Cormac turned off the screen. He placed the phone on the blanket. And when he spoke, he used the voice of someone who had prepared this answer a long time ago and didn't like it very much. Because you work 16 hours a day. Cormac, because I'm 21 years old. He shrugged. I have to be able to take care of something myself. You can't be the only person in this family who knows how to worry. Marlowe had no answer for that. She sat there and looked at her younger brother, the child she had carried into parent-teacher meetings when she was 19, now sitting on a hospital bed, a head taller than she was, explaining to her how responsibility should be divided within a family. You called emergency services yourself. Yeah, alone. I remembered the number. It's an easy number. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It simply escaped. Idiot. The idiot is the person who just ran 14 blocks when the number 8 bus comes straight here. The bill was $2,300. They handed it to her at the desk, clipped inside a plastic folder, along with a sheet explaining installment options and a financial counseling number available from 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock on weekdays. Marlo went out and sat in the hallway. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears when she was 19. She had used all of them during the final 4 months of her mother's life, and they hadn't returned once since then. She took out her phone. She didn't call Sullivan. She thought about calling him. Her finger was already resting on his name. He would answer on the first ring, ask where she was, and within an hour, the bill would disappear as though it had never existed, and that was precisely why she didn't call. She opened her photo library, scrolled down, past the 32 photographs of the transfer documents, past the photograph of the eviction notice, past the photograph of her bedroom floor, the grout line between the 3rd tile and the 4th. Then she reached a photograph taken 3 weeks earlier. A business card lying on table 6. The man with the gold-rimmed glasses had left it there on a Wednesday afternoon. He had sat for 10 minutes, drunk 1 cup of tea, said nothing except thank you, and left. She had thrown the card into the trash. But before throwing it away, she had photographed it, because that was what Marlo Hartigan did with everything. There wasn't a company name, only a phone number. She entered the number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. 40 seconds. She closed the screen. She hadn't called, not because she didn't want to, because she knew that some doors, once knocked upon, could never be closed again. She didn't call that number. She did something else. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Marlo Hartigan pushed through the glass doors of the Vasquez Freight Building and walked straight across the lobby with the $2,300 bill in her coat pocket. The receptionist stood up. You need an appointment. Tell him my brother is at Northwestern, and I can't afford another night. The young woman looked at her. Then she looked at the worn canvas bag. Marlo held tightly against her chest, her knuckles white. She picked up the phone. 3 minutes later, Marlo was on the 41st floor. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room, with the whole city spread out behind the man across from her, and she poured everything out. Her card had been frozen. The bank manager had told her she should leave. Cormac's scholarship was still suspended, on day 11, and no one had removed the flag. The eviction notice and Mr. Petrakis saying he had a family, Mr. Tobin. The cup of coffee still warm on the table inside the apartment with the open door. The $2,300 bill she would spend 4 years paying, and the tin box beneath her bed moved 2 inches to the left. Sullivan listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once. Then he picked up the phone, pressed one button. Deacon, come up here. 40 seconds later, the door opened. Sullivan asked him a question, in Spanish. His voice wasn't any louder than when he ordered coffee, but it carried the edge of a blade slicing through paper, and Deacon Fry, a man 6 feet 3 inches tall, straightened as though he had been shocked. Deacon answered. His eyes stayed on his employer. He didn't look at her. He never gave a report in front of the subject. That was the rule. But he was on the 41st floor, and the subject was a 26-year-old Irish waitress from Bridgeport, and he was speaking Spanish, and that was a calculation he would remember for the rest of his life. Marlo stood up, and she answered him. In Spanish, I've served coffee on the South Side for 6 years, Mr. Fry. What do you think I learned? Deacon went still, so did Sullivan. For a breathless moment, there wasn't a sound in the room 41 floors above the ground. Speak English, she said. Both of you. Sullivan looked at her, very slowly, like a man who had just realized he had been reading the map wrong for the entire journey. Deacon says you've been investigating me. Marlo didn't move. You have a tin box beneath your bed, 6 years of records. A piece of cardboard with my company's name written on it. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. You went into my home. It wasn't me, but it was one of your people. Sullivan fell silent. He didn't answer that. He looked at Deacon, and Deacon looked back. And there was something in that exchange Marlo couldn't read then but would understand later, when it was already too late. And then Marlo exploded. 6 years. For 7 years, she had forced it down into the bottom of a Christmas cookie tin, and all of it came out in 40 seconds. You want to know what I've been investigating? Fine. My mother's name was Nuala Hartigan. Sullivan didn't move. She was a nurse. 30 years. Night shifts, emergency department, the same hospital where my brother spent last night. For 30 years, she gave water to people who were dying, and not once did she ask anyone for anything. Her voice didn't tremble. That was the frightening part. She died in 2019 because she was pushed to the bottom of the liver transplant list. 3 weeks. She was 3 weeks away from her turn, and someone paid to cut ahead of her, and she was pushed down, and she never came back up. A pause. I've spent 6 years trying to find out who. 38 petitions, 2 Freedom of Information Act denials. I left law school to care for her, and then I used those 2 years of legal training to search for the person who killed her. A pause. And every road led back to your company. Sullivan said nothing. Say something. He remained silent. His face didn't change. He only looked at her, and those gray eyes gave her nothing. Say something. Sullivan opened a drawer. He took out a yellowed sheet of paper, lined paper torn from a cheap notebook. He placed it on the desk, flat, straight. He pushed it toward her. 11 names. Handwritten, slanting to the right, capital letters too large. Blue ink faded to the color of ash. The 4th name. Nuala Hartigan, 2019. This is my father's handwriting. Marlo Hartigan had spent 6 years searching for an answer. She had never prepared herself to receive one. Marlo looked at the sheet of paper for exactly 4 seconds. She didn't pick it up. She didn't ask who the other 10 names belonged to. She didn't ask why it was kept in the desk drawer of the man whose father had written it. She turned and walked toward the door. She descended 41 floors in an elevator with music playing, and she would always remember that there had been music, a soft, meaningless piano melody, and she stood there listening to it all the way down. When she reached the sidewalk, the black car was already waiting. Deacon stood beside the rear door, one hand resting on the handle. She walked past him. She didn't get into the car. She walked 40 minutes. It took 40 minutes to walk from the loop back to Bridgeport if a person moved quickly, and Marlo moved quickly. And the November wind off the lake swept across the avenues and cut through her thin coat as though it weren't there at all. The black car drove beside her, 3 meters away. For the entire 40 minutes. The windows stayed up. It didn't honk. No one lowered a window. No one called her name. It didn't speed ahead to block her path. Didn't stop and wait for her to reconsider. Didn't do any of the things a car belonging to Sullivan Vasquez Rourke could have done. It simply stayed with her. Across the bridge. Past the place where the railroad tracks crossed the road. Through 4 red lights that she walked against while the car had to stop and then catch up. Past 1 dark block, then 1 lit block, then another dark block. During those 40 minutes, Marlo didn't think about anything. That was the strangest part. She had assumed she would think. She had waited 6 years to have something to think about, but her mind was empty, and her legs kept moving, and only one sentence repeated itself over and over like a broken record. 3 weeks. She was 3 weeks away from her turn. When she reached her building, she stopped. The car stopped too. 3 meters away. She turned around, walked toward it, knocked twice on the window with her knuckles. The window lowered. He sat there in the darkness, looking at her, and he didn't speak first. Why didn't you tell me? Sullivan looked directly into her face. Because I've been looking for you since 2019. Marlo stopped breathing. I had your address. I had your brother's name, his age, his school. I had the exact balance of your mother's medical debt down to the last cent. I've had a signed check in my desk drawer for 7 years. And I sign it again once every year because checks expire after 6 months. A pause. I've sat outside this apartment 3 times. She looked toward the curb with the Y-shaped crack she had stepped over twice a day for 4 years. Why didn't you give it to me? Silence. A car passed. Somewhere behind the rows of buildings, a dog barked. Because money couldn't bring your mother back. A pause. And because I was a coward, it was the most honest thing Sullivan Vasquez Rourke had said to anyone in 7 years. And he said it through a lowered car window to a woman standing in the wind in a thin coat at 10 o'clock at night in Bridgeport. Marlo stood there. She should have gone upstairs. Her door was 4 steps away. Cormac was asleep over his books. She had a shift at 9 o'clock the next morning. She should have gone upstairs. She got into the car. She didn't forgive him. She needed that to be perfectly clear, even to herself, even in the moment she closed the car door. She simply didn't want to go home yet. But on some nights, those were the same thing. For 4 minutes, The car didn't seem to be heading anywhere at all. Then Sullivan gave Deacon an address in Pilsen, and Deacon turned. It was a small cafe on 18th Street, with yellow lights, 6 tables, and an elderly woman standing behind the counter. She watched Sullivan walk in, and she wasn't afraid. And she didn't bow her head, and she didn't call him sir. She said something in Spanish that meant, "You've gotten thinner." She led them into a small room in the back, poured tea, and left. "Tell me the truth," Marlowe said. "All of it," and he did. He stopped choosing his words. That was the first thing she noticed. For 7 weeks, she had listened to him speak and always felt there was a space between one sentence and the next, a place where he was cutting something away. This time, there weren't any spaces. His father's name was Declan Rourke. He had built an empire from nothing by turning people into numbers, and he had been so good at it that no one had ever seen him angry, not even his own son. The list of 11 names had been inside the safe. Sullivan found it 3 days after his father was shot to death in the parking lot of a church in Bridgeport, exactly 9 blocks from where Marlowe was sitting now. He was 31 years old, too young and too angry. "I thought it was a list of debts. It took me 3 weeks to understand it was a list of people. 9 years. 7 years. 9 people had been repaid quietly, each handled in a different way so they would never suspect the source." He spoke of them briefly, his voice dropping as he reached the end. "The 10th person died with no children left to repay." A pause. "And then there was the 4th name, your mother. She left behind 2 children, and you sat outside my apartment 3 times. "Yes." Marlowe turned the teacup in her hands. She hadn't taken a single sip. "If I weren't a Hartigan," she said, "would you still sit at the corner table at 5 o'clock in the morning?" He was silent for a long time. "My father's company bought the diner 9 years ago. Through another legal entity, as part of a group of 11 small properties. Before I knew you existed." A pause. "But if you're asking whether I would sit at the corner table at 5 o'clock in the morning." A pause. "No. Not if you weren't you." Marlowe set down the teacup. She placed both hands flat on the table. "All right, then there are rules. Rules. 1. You don't lie to me. I don't need to know everything. There are things I don't want to know, and I won't ask. But you aren't allowed to lie. All right. 2. You don't pay my debt." He said nothing. 84,000, he said after a moment. "I know exactly how much it is, thank you, Marlowe. $84,000 is the only thing I have left of my mother." Her voice wasn't loud. It was simply very, very steady. "I don't have her house. I don't have her car. I don't have her ring. I sold it in 2020 to pay the electric bill. I have a Christmas cookie, tin, and $84,000 in debt. That's all the proof I have that she ever existed in this world." A pause. "You aren't allowed to take that away from me." He hesitated over that rule for a long time, longer than she had ever seen him hesitate over anything. "You're asking me to sit and watch?" "Yes, for 4 years. For 4 years, is that the punishment?" "No." She looked at him. "It's trust. I'm trusting you to sit and watch." It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked Sullivan Vasquez Rourke to do, and he knew it, and she knew he knew. "All right," he said. 3. At the diner. You're the owner. I'm an employee. Boundaries. All right, your turn, he thought. Then, he said, 1. When you take the train at 2 o'clock in the morning, you text me when you get home. That isn't a rule. That's you controlling me. It's my rule." Marlowe was about to argue. She looked at his face and she didn't. 2. And his voice shifted into something that made her sit straighter without realizing she had done it. "If anything feels wrong, anyone, at any time, you tell me immediately." A pause. "My world has sharp edges, Marlowe. I need to know if one of them cuts you." They shook hands. His hand was dry and warm, with knuckles that were permanently swollen, and the handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds, and afterward neither of them touched the other for even 1 more second. But they both knew. They had just signed something more dangerous than any contract Nadia Voss had ever drafted. After that night, a new rhythm began. He appeared every morning at 5 o'clock. The corner table, black coffee, his iPad propped at an angle. He never said anything, never called her over, never raised a hand. Only the faintest nod when she passed, and that nod meant the chair across from him was empty if she wanted it. She always did. 5 o'clock in the morning was the dead hour. The night shift had gone home, the morning shift hadn't arrived, and for those 40 minutes, Sallow's diner held only 2 people and a coffee machine that groaned to itself. "I studied law for 2 years, she said one morning. Then my mother got sick, and I left. What kind of law were you planning to practice?" "Labor law. I wanted to sue people who paid less than minimum wage." she laughed. You see, life has a sense of humor. He didn't laugh. I can still read contracts faster than almost anyone I know, she said. One glance at a page, and I know where the trap is. It's the most useless skill a waitress could possibly have. Sullivan looked at her a little longer than necessary, but he didn't say anything. He told her about his sister, Source, 27 years old, studying music in Boston, calling him every week to complain that their mother was still trying to match her with the sons of people she didn't even like herself. Does she know what you do? She knows enough not to ask. That isn't an answer. It's the most honest answer I have. Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently? Every day. That's sad. That's honest. Cormac met him one Saturday afternoon when he stopped by the diner to pick up his keys and found a man sitting at the corner table. He dropped into the chair across from him without being invited. Are you in the mafia? Cormac, Marlowe said from behind the counter. I work in freight, Sullivan said. Sure, and I'm a model. Sullivan glanced at the book tucked beneath Cormac's arm. Then he looked at him. You're stuck on the chapter about shear stress. Page 340. Cormac blinked. How do you know? Because you've left the book open to that page for 3 weeks. Your sister carried it with her twice so you could keep studying when she got home. Same page. Cormac looked at his sister, looked at Sullivan, looked back at his sister. He's in the mafia. I work in freight, Sullivan said. Freight requires structural engineering. Who needs structural engineering to move cargo? Bridges, Sullivan said. A 40-ton truck crosses a bridge built in 1962. You calculate shear stress incorrectly. You lose the truck, the cargo, and the driver. Cormac was silent for about 3 seconds. All right, he said. Explain this to me. And they sat there for 40 minutes, a second-year student, and a man the entire city had learned to lower its eyes around, arguing about torque. Marlowe stood behind the counter and pretended to polish glasses. No one touched anyone. That was the strangest thing about those 2 months. He didn't take her hand. She didn't touch his shoulder. There were only accidental brushes when she passed him a coffee cup, her fingers and his half an inch apart, then 1/100th of a second of contact, and then nothing. The air was full of almost and not yet. That night, Marlowe came home, and Cormac was still awake. He sat at the kitchen table with his book, and for the first time in 3 weeks, it had been turned to page 341. You smile more, he said without looking up. I don't. You smile more, Lo. He looked up. I haven't seen it in 6 years. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the keys still in her hand. Later, after he had fallen asleep, she went into his room to turn off the desk lamp he never remembered to switch off, and she sat down on the edge of his bed, and for the first time in 6 years, she thought about a question she had never allowed herself to ask. Was she allowed to be happy? At 2 o'clock in the morning, the diner was empty, and Marlowe was wiping down the last table. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up right away. She thought it was the wind. The man walked in and sat at table 6, gold-rimmed glasses, an expensive coat folded neatly across his lap, carefully, the way someone might fold a flag. He placed both hands on the uneven tabletop and looked around the room with the expression of a man reading an information plaque in a museum. Miss Hartigan. I was hoping I'd find you here. We're closed. I didn't come to eat. Marlowe recognized him. Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks earlier, 10 minutes, 1 cup of tea, not a single word except thank you, and a business card left on this very table. He didn't threaten her. That was exactly what made him frightening. His voice was even, warm, faintly tired, the voice of a professor explaining for the 3rd time, something the entire lecture hall should have understood the first time. I didn't come to frighten you. Honestly, I came to warn you. Warn me about what? Who do you think froze your account? Marlowe didn't answer immediately. Marcus Odell, she said. A logistics manager. Prosser smiled. Very slightly, not triumphantly. It was the smile of a teacher hearing the brightest student in the class give the wrong answer to a question that was far too easy, and for half a second, Marlowe felt the floor beneath her soften. Marcus Odell is a very convenient name. He placed an envelope on the table. Brown envelope, unstamped, with no name written on it. He pushed it toward the center of the table with 2 fingers, then withdrew his hand. Inside is a copy of the contract from 2019, the one that pushed your mother to the bottom of the list. Marlowe's heart stopped. It truly stopped. She felt it, the empty space between 2 beats, longer than it should have been. Why are you giving me this? Because I want Rourke table. He said it in the tone people used when discussing the weather. And you're the least expensive way to get it. At least he was honest. Read page 3, Prosser said. Declan Rourke's signature. But you already knew that. Sullivan showed you the paper in his drawer, didn't he? 11 names. Marlowe didn't ask how he knew. She would ask later. She would never ask. Prosser stood, adjusted his tie. He draped the coat over his shoulders with the unhurried motion of a man who had never rushed in his life. But the person who drafted the contract signed page 12. A pause. And that person still works for Sullivan Vasquez Rourke. A pause. Every day, the bell rang. He left. Marlowe stood there with the cleaning cloth in her hand for about 4 seconds. Then she sat where he had been sitting and tore open the envelope. She didn't begin at the first page. 2 years of law school made her fingers do automatically what they had done hundreds of times through hundreds of hours of study. Skip the introduction, skip the clauses, skip the definitions, turn straight to the end, to the signatures, to the place where witnesses and drafters signed their names, because that was the only place in a contract where no one could lie. Page 3. Declan Rourke. Handwriting slanting to the right, capital letters too large. She had seen it before. She turned the page. Page 12, a small signature, neat. Every letter standing apart, almost like print. Nadia Voss. Marlowe stared at it for a long time, not Deacon Fry, who had stood outside the office window and watched her take 32 photographs without telling anyone. Not Marcus Odell. She took out her phone, entered the name. 3 seconds. There wasn't a Marcus Odell in the logistic department at Vasquez Freight. There wasn't a Marcus Odell in any corporate filing in the state of Illinois. There wasn't a Marcus Odell with a brother-in-law working in a credit department. There wasn't a Marcus Odell at all. There never had been. 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 41st floor. She didn't have an appointment. No one stopped her anymore. The security guard in the lobby looked at her for 1 second, then pressed the elevator button, and that was the detail Marlowe would remember later and feel sick over. She had become someone who didn't need an appointment. Sullivan was sitting at his desk, the city lights behind him. She placed the envelope on the desk. She didn't say anything. He opened it. He didn't ask what it was. He pulled out the stack of papers, and he didn't start at the beginning. He turned straight to page 12. He wasn't surprised. Marlowe saw it. She saw it in the half-second before he could do anything with his face, and in that half-second, her entire world collapsed without making a sound. You knew, I knew, for how long? He didn't evade the question. That was rule number 1, and he had promised, and he was the kind of man who kept his word even when the promise was killing him. 9 years, Marlowe stepped back. 9 years, 9 years. You bought me an umbrella. Her voice was very calm. That was the frightening part. You kept the table with the uneven leg. You had someone hold the chair every time I climbed up. You sat at the corner table at 5 o'clock in the morning for these past months and listened to me talk about my mother. A pause. And all that time you knew who had, yes, why? He stood. And for the first time in the entire story, Sullivan Vasquez Rourke's voice broke. Because Nadia Voss keeps everything. He stepped out from behind the desk. Every name, every account, every legal entity, every signature, everything I've done in 9 years, and everything my father did in the 30 years before that. She's the architecture of this entire house. Then burn the house down. 3,200 families. Marlowe fell silent. Dock workers at the South Harbor, drivers, welders, my people, my father's people, and their children. If Nadia falls, she'll drag all of them down with her. She'll do it within 4 hours, and she'll do it very well, because she's the one who taught me how. A pause. Including the 9 people I repaid, Marlowe looked up. That money wasn't legal, Marlowe. Not 1 cent of it. The auto repair shop in Cicero. The mortgage in Berwyn. The scholarship from an organization with no website. If Nadia speaks, those 9 families lose everything, and some of them will go to prison, and none of them knows why. A pause. Including Bridget, Marlowe stood perfectly still. Bridget? He said nothing. Which Bridget? He remained silent, and the silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. And during those 3 seconds, Marlowe understood that she was about to hear something she would never be able to forget. Bridget Okonkwo Hale is my father's cousin. Marlowe stopped breathing. She left the family when she was 30. She didn't take a cent. She changed her last name, bought a diner with her own money, and didn't speak to anyone in the family for 22 years. A pause. Then my father died. Then I bought her diner along with 11 other properties. And I let her stay and manage it because she was the only person in the family who could still hold her head up. A pause. And 6 years ago she gave you a job. A pause. Because she knew who you were. Marlowe sat down. She didn't choose to. Her legs couldn't hold her, and there was a chair there, and she fell into it. My whole life, her voice was so quiet it was almost impossible to hear. Has my whole life been compensation from your family? No. Then what was it? Sullivan looked at her, and he said the truest thing he knew. A family trying to make amends without having the courage to apologize. Marlowe stood. She walked toward the door. At the doorway, she stopped. She didn't turn around. Marcus O'Dell doesn't exist. Sullivan said nothing. I checked. No one by that name works for your company. No one by that name exists anywhere in this state. A pause. You gave me a false name. No. She turned around, and this time his face had gone white. Nadia gave me that name, he said. I trusted her. A pause. Marlowe. The person who entered your home wasn't one of my people. A pause. I didn't know who had entered your home. A pause. Until 30 seconds ago, she left. This time he didn't send the car after her, because this time he had something else to do. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Bridget was making coffee, just as she had every day for 6 years. Pour the water, pull the lever, wait for the machine to groan, then stop. You knew. Bridget didn't turn around, she only stopped moving. Yes. 6 years, 6 years, she turned around, her eyes were red. She had already cried somewhere before Marlowe arrived, then wiped her face and gone out to make coffee as she did every day, because it was the only thing she knew how to do. I meant to tell you, 100 times. I practiced it in my head. I even had an opening sentence, a pause, but every time I opened my mouth I saw you. 20 years old, thin as a stick, standing in that doorway asking whether there was any work, a pause. And all I saw was that you needed a job, and I had one. That wasn't making amends, Marlowe said. That was hiding the crime. Bridget nodded. Slowly. Yes, I know, there was no forgiveness, no tearful embrace. No one apologized to anyone. There were only 2 women standing inside a diner at 6 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee that had soaked into the walls for 30 years. Marlowe untied her apron, folded it neatly, square, placed it on the counter. Prosser called at 10 o'clock. Give me the tin box, along with page 12. I'll have Nadia Voss in federal court before Christmas. You'll get justice for your mother, her name in the newspapers, and a public apology from that hospital. I'll get work table. What about the 3,200 families? They're not your problem, Miss Hartigan. A pause. They never were. She went to see Sullivan at noon. For the last time. He didn't ask what she intended to do. He only stood when she entered, something he had never done for anyone. Will you stop me? No. Even if I destroy everything you have. Even then, why? Because you made me promise to sit and watch. A pause. And that was the most honorable thing you've ever asked me to do. Marlowe looked at him for a long time. You're terrible at fighting for what you want. I fight for everything I want. A pause. But not you. You aren't something to be won or kept. She left with the tin box beneath her arm. At 9 o'clock the next morning, at the Cook County State's Attorney's office, Marlowe placed the box on the desk. Then she didn't open it. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't Prosser's contract. That remained inside the brown envelope in her bedroom drawer, and it would stay there until she died. This was something she had found herself. 6 years, 38 petitions, 2 Freedom of Information Act denials, and 1 approval in March of the previous year. A 4-line document she hadn't understood then, hadn't understood for 14 months, until 2 o'clock the night before, when she saw a signature on page 12, and suddenly those 4 lines made sense. A transfer record. The money from 2019 hadn't gone directly to one place. It had been divided into 2 parts. Most of it went where Declan Rourke intended it to go. The smaller portion, 18%, went into a personal account, in Nadia Voss's name. She had skimmed it, hidden it even from Declan Rourke. No one had known for 9 years because the only person who could have discovered it had been killed in the church parking lot 3 months later. The prosecutor turned the page over. Read it. Turned it back. Read it again. Looked up. Only one name? Only one name, Miss Hartigan. If this is real, it could open up a great deal more. Is there anything else in the box? Marlowe placed her hand on the lid. She left it there for about 3 seconds. No, Nadia Voss was indicted 11 days later. Alone. Her own charges. Her own money. Her own account. Not one line in the indictment mentioned Rourke Table. Rourke Table remained standing, and 3,200 people went to work the following morning without knowing anything had happened. Prosser called at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And for the first time, his voice didn't sound anything like a professor's. You ruined me. You said I was the least expensive way to get Rourke table. A pause. You were wrong. I was the most expensive. She ended the call. Then she did the thing she had postponed for 6 years. She went to visit her mother's grave. For 7 years, she hadn't gone, because she had told herself she would go when she had an answer, that she wouldn't stand before that headstone with empty hands. The November wind swept across the cemetery. A simple low stone marker with no decoration. Nuala Hartigan, Nurse. That was all. She had chosen those words when she was 19, and now she understood why. Sullivan stood 10 meters away. He didn't come closer. Marlowe didn't turn around, but she knew he was there. She always knew. You can come closer, he did. They stood there for a while, 2 people, 1 headstone, and the wind. You didn't give Prosser everything, he said. No. Why? She looked at the headstone. Because my mother was a nurse, 30 years, night shifts. She gave water to people who were dying, and she never asked whether they had insurance. A pause. She wouldn't trade 3,200 people for her name in the newspapers. She would have slapped me if I'd done that. A pause. And because I didn't want my justice to smell like the thing that killed her. Sullivan said nothing. He simply stood there, and that was exactly what she needed. Where is Mr. Tobin? Portland, with his daughter. She had been asking him to live with her for 8 years, and he had refused for 8 years. Who took him there? Deacon. She turned toward him. Deacon thought you were a threat, Sullivan said. Then he read your file. He realized Prosser's men were starting to watch the diner, and anyone connected to you. It was Prosser's men who had bribed your landlord and searched your apartment, hunting for anything they could use against Sullivan. To keep him safe, Deacon had to act fast because Prosser's men were already watching the street. He quietly convinced Mr. Tobin to leave for his own safety before Prosser's men could close in, packing his bags and putting him on a private flight to Portland. Deacon purposely left a minor security code on the apartment's lock to let me know the old man was safe, though he kept the transfer a secret to protect us both. A pause. And he didn't report it to anyone. Not even me, Marlowe laughed, for the first time in 3 weeks. 3 months later, at 5 o'clock in the morning, at Sallow's diner, Table 6 still had one uneven leg. It was still propped up with the piece of cardboard folded into quarters. The oak table was still in the corner beside the broken jukebox, and no one ever sat there. Marlowe was no longer a waitress. Bridget didn't sell the diner. She transferred ownership, and Marlowe signed a notarized promissory agreement, with monthly installments and an interest rate exactly equal to the bank's rate, not 1% more or less. This isn't a gift, Marlowe said as she put pen to paper. This is a contract. I'll repay every dollar, I know, Bridget said. That's why I'm giving it to you. Sullivan sat at the corner table, black coffee, iPad. Marlowe placed the cup in front of him. No need to ask. I'm staying, you never intended to leave. I'm staying with you. He set the cup down, very slowly. Those are 2 different things, yes. And I'm choosing both. Why? Because I spent 6 years running toward an answer. Now I have it, a pause, and it didn't fix anything. My mother still isn't coming back. Not one day became better because I learned the name of the person who did it. A pause. But you're here, every day, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Even through the 3 months when I refused to speak to you. I promised I'd show up every day, I know. That's why, a pause. I love you, he repeated it, as though testing each word in his mouth, as though no one had ever placed those words in his hands before. You love me, is that a problem? He stood. No, it isn't a problem at all, because I love you too. I've loved you since you fell asleep on my shoulder and trusted a stranger enough to let yourself rest. You're being sweet again. I thought we had an agreement. Only with you. He reached out, touched her cheek. For the first time in the entire story, she didn't pull away that Saturday. Little Rosie came in with her mother, and Marlowe, now the owner of the diner, still bent down beneath the counter and pretended to search for a very long time before bringing out an oatmeal cookie wrapped in wax paper. 1 year later, at 2:14 in the morning, on the Red Line, Marlowe had a car, Marlowe had money for a taxi, but every Tuesday they still took the train. Cormac sat across from them, headphones in, smiling at his phone. Deacon sat 3 seats away, pretending to read a newspaper. He wasn't very good at pretending. Marlowe slept against Sullivan's shoulder. Now she did it on purpose. He shifted his shoulder slightly, only slightly, so her neck wouldn't ache. He watched her reflection in the window across from them. Her face relaxed. Their stop arrived. He remained seated. 6 stops. Chicago had taken many things from Marlowe Hartigan. her mother. 6 years she would never get back. An answer that turned out not to heal anything, but it had also given her a train ride at 2:14 in the morning, and a shoulder that didn't pull away. They would figure out the rest together. One day, one choice, one moment. And if it had all begun with her falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder, then that was only the universe being a little dramatic. Marlo Hartigan wouldn't have wanted it any other way. If this story kept you awake until the very last line, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, so you'll have a new story to listen to every day. Share this video with someone you think has been having a very long week, because sometimes a story that arrives at the right moment is worth more than advice. And we truly want to know how this story made you feel, which moment made you stop, and which line stayed with you the longest. Leave a comment below and share what's deep in your heart, because we read every single comment, and those feelings are the reason we keep telling stories. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.